The newly formed Finnish Navy of the early 1920s was comprised of nothing more than obsolete vessels left behind by the Russians. The Russian Navy was in disarray due to the Russian Civil War, among other reasons, hence the abandoned vessels in Finland. The early Finnish Navy consisted of 4 gunboats, named Karjala, Klaus Horn, Matti Kurki, and Turunmaa, 8 C-class torpedo boats, 6 S-class torpedo boats, 5 T-class mine-laying boats, a mine-layer named Louhi, and several minesweepers. As such, without any sizable warships, the Finnish Navy was essentially a coastal navy. Finland's navy was clearly in need of modernizing, and after years of wrangling in the country's parliament, a budget was released in 1927 to achieve that. The plan was to build 2 coastal defense ships and a further 4 submarines. Motor torpedo boats, or MTBs, were to be built locally as well as acquired from Britain. A training ship, the Suomen Joutsen, was also acquired. The budget also earmarked the local construction of more minesweepers. By 1939, the Finnish Navy had a total of 190 ships, including auxiliary crafts, and 363 motorboats. The professional navy consisted of 3,544 men, with a further 295 in training. However, total manpower in the country committed to sea and coastal defenses was 33,200 strong, of which 20,700 men were ready for service at coastal batteries and coast defense units. Those coastal defenses were to prove pivotal when a certain neighboring giant decided to invade. The Soviet Union invaded Finland on November 30, 1939, 1 day short of 3 months since the outbreak of World War II. The Finns had been weary of the Soviets for years, but the invasion still came as a shock, especially since Finland had already declared its neutrality when Germany invaded Poland. The invasion would trigger what would be called the Winter War between the USSR and Finland, a bitter skirmish fought in frigid conditions and which lasted 3.5 months. The Finns were helped by the state of the Soviet military by 1939. By then, many of the Soviet Union's best military leaders, strategists, and officers had been murdered or exiled during Stalin's brutal purges during the mid to late 1930s. The army sent by the USSR, which was comprised primarily of Ukrainian battalions, was poorly armed and had the completely wrong kit for the Arctic conditions. Stalin had also severely underestimated the resolve of the Finns to defend their homeland, as well as the strength and effectiveness of their coastal defensive batteries. The Finns also knew their own terrain, were excellent cross-country skiers, and even made good use of Molotov cocktails, which had first been used during the recent Spanish Civil War. The Soviets were simply not expecting the Finns to put up such as strong resistance. Historians differ as to exactly why Stalin ordered his troops to invade Finland, but a safe bet is that the Soviets wanted to occupy and neutralize Finland, thereby ensuring that Finland wouldn't be used as a staging post for an enemy country, especially the Germans. The Soviets may have signed a non-aggression pact with Germany in August 1939, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but Stalin still didn't trust Hitler. In fact, it's well known that the Soviet leader loathed the little Austrian. Stalin was right about that because Hitler, ever the treacherous and conniving liar, still went ahead and invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. Within a week of the invasion, the Soviet Union imposed a naval blockade in which it threatened to sink any vessels within 20 nautical miles of the Finnish coast. It transpired that the Soviets did little to enforce this threat during that time. Even with the threat of this blockade, the Finnish Navy was still able to occupy the Åland Islands at the entrance to the Gulf of Bothnia in the Baltic Sea, and which until then had been a demilitarized zone. The Finnish Navy immediately laid down hundreds of sea mines in the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga. The latter is not only Europe's largest freshwater lake, but also strategically well located in the Baltic region. Until 1940, the lake was shared between Finland and Russia. That would end when the Soviets took full control of it in the aftermath of the Winter War, and today Lake Ladoga is in Russian territory. Finland's other main objective was to protect its merchant shipping. During the first month of the war, battles took place between Soviet ships and well-guarded Finnish coastal batteries at Hanko and Koivisto on the country's southern coast, as well as Uto, the southernmost continuously inhabited island in Finland. Koivisto would also eventually be ceded to the Soviets, and is today the second-largest Russian port on the Baltic Sea after St. Petersburg. In 1939, it was a Finnish port. The Finnish Navy did what it could to disrupt Soviet merchant shipping, with the Russians calling these Finnish efforts the sand in the Russian boot. The biggest fear for the Finns was that Soviet troops could sweep across the frozen Baltic Sea, thereby reaching mainland Finland with far greater ease. These dreaded flanking maneuvers were only prevented by the relentless and brave defenses put up by the thousands of naval reserves at various coastal forts, backed by the Finnish army. Once the Baltic Sea froze over, the Finnish Navy had two critical missions. The first was to prevent an amphibious invasion onto Finnish shores by Soviet forces, and the second was to keep its vital sea routes to the west secured and operational. So, while Finnish naval vessels were mainly inactive due to a mostly frozen Baltic, the Finnish Navy still played an important role in the armed resistance along the country's southern coastal approaches. Fortunately, Finland lost just one warship during the Winter War, the escort ship, Aura-2, and that was only because the vessel detonated a depth charge on itself while hunting a Soviet submarine. Finnish merchant ships were less fortunate during the entirety of the war, with 26 of them sunk. Interestingly, only 5 of these merchant ships were sunk by the Soviets. The majority of Finnish merchant vessels were either sunk by the Germans or as a result of their own sea mines. However, after 101 days of tough fighting, the vastly outnumbered Finns were exhausted and out of critical supplies and ammunition. Finland was forced to surrender and had to cede 10% of its territory to the Soviets as part of the Moscow Peace Treaty of March 13, 1940. However, the Finnish still maintained their sovereignty and the country would remain unoccupied by the USSR. Somewhat ironically, even though the Germans had sunk many of its merchant vessels, Finland would still side with the Germans during Operation Barbarossa, which started on June 22, 1941. Such was the hatred the Finns had toward the Russians. Barbarossa was the infamous and ultimately foolhardy campaign in which Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Finland gave full access to German naval vessels and troops as a launchpad into the USSR. Stalin had been right after all. Fortunately for the rest of Europe, Hitler's obsession with conquering Russia and subsequent defeat by the Soviets on the Eastern Front would be the eventual undoing of the Third Reich. There were some major events that affected the Finnish Navy during Operation Barbarossa. The pride of the Finnish Navy, the coastal defense flagship Ilmarinen, formed part of the German fleet during Operation Nordwind in September 1941. The operation was a ploy to lure Soviet ships further into the Baltic Sea as a diversionary tactic for German operations further south. Unfortunately for the Finnish ship, it hit a Soviet mine, or possibly two, causing a massive explosion in its hull. The ship eventually sank with 271 fatalities. The sinking of the Ilmarine remains the largest loss in the history of the Finnish Navy to this day. Then on December 3, 1941, the Soviet troop transport ship, the Iosif Stalin, was hit by German naval fire. The Soviet ship was evacuating thousands of its forces from its base in the aforementioned port of Hanko, which was on Finland's southern coast. The death blow to the Soviet transport ship came from a 12-inch cannon shot by a Finnish coastal battery at Makiluoto Fortress. Nearly 3,000 Soviet servicemen lost their lives on board, with 1,000 more captured by the Germans. It would mark the end of nearly all Soviet naval activity in the Gulf of Finland for the remainder of the war. A consequence of Finland jumping to assist the Germans in Operation Barbarossa was that the Soviets invaded Finland once again, this time with air raids on Finnish cities. This happened on June 25, 1941, 3 days after Barbarossa was launched. To be fair, the Finns were asking for it by having sided with the Nazis, and the Soviets were itching to finish what they'd tried to do in the Winter War. The Finns had been warned by Western European states about siding so strongly with Germany, but Finland was resolute in its opposition to the USSR. The Finns were also freaked out by the recent proclamation of the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania being turned into Soviet republics. They were scared that Finland would be next in what was viewed as Soviet expansionism during wartime. What would become known as the Continuation War would drag on for more than 3 years. The Finns were able to make some gains, including regaining the territorial boundaries it had prior to the Moscow Peace Treaty of the year before. Importantly, the Finns were able to regain control of the Isthmus of Karelia. In the meantime, the Soviets were getting battered by the Germans and were forced to mount the biggest mobilization in modern history. The Finnish Navy did play a role in the Continuation War. On May 17, 1942, Finnish Lieutenant General Paavo Talvela proposed a joint Finnish-German-Italian unit based at Lake Ladoga, the purpose of which would be to disrupt Soviet supply convoys to and from the major port of Leningrad, which is today St. Petersburg. The unit was named Naval Detachment K and was comprised of 4 German KM-type minelayers, 4 Italian MAS torpedo motorboats, and the Finnish torpedo motorboat Sisu. The unit did sink numerous smaller Soviet vessels and also assaulted enemy bases and beachfronts, albeit with limited success. Soviet convoys of the Soviet Baltic Fleet remained relatively unaffected during this time. The Finnish Navy also joined with the German Kriegsmarine to intensify anti-submarine operations in the Baltic. Anti-submarine nets and surrounding minefields were laid down, eventually posing an insurmountable threat to the safe passage of Soviet subs. 12 Soviet submarines would be sunk, 3 of which were by Finnish submarines. Finnish naval intelligence also helped in the interception of communications between Allied convoy vessels operating to Murmansk in the Arctic Ocean. These interceptions were shared by the Finns with their German counterparts. By 1944, the Soviets had the upper hand against both the Germans and Finns. Air raids were being conducted on the Finnish capital, Helsinki, and Soviet occupation was a very real possibility. Once again, the Finns had to surrender, and the Moscow armistice signed on September 19, 1944. This time, the Finns were forced to make even more concessions. In retrospect, Finland's track record during the Second World War was somewhat schizophrenic. On the one hand, its navy and ground forces fought with immense tenacity against Soviet invasion, particularly its coastal defenses. On the other hand, the country chose to side with Nazi Germany in the latter's demented foray into the USSR. It was an opportunistic move that resulted in Finland's surrender. Of all the European countries and their naval operations during World War II, that of Finland is surely one of the most unique.